silk. The smooth-talking kingpin draped in Gucci ruled London's streets with a deadly mix of style and violence, until betrayal from within turned his empire into a battleground. In the heart of London's busiest streets, where neon lights flicker against the night sky, a new kind of criminal world was quietly taking shape. It was a world where gunshots echoed through alleyways just steps away from exclusive clubs, and where the latest designer clothes and flashy cars were as much a part of the scene as the danger lurking beneath. This was the beginning of the story of the Knights, a small gang that would grow to become one of the most feared and glamorous criminal organizations in modern Britain. The Knights didn't start with violence or guns. Their origins were humble, a group of young men from working-class neighborhoods, struggling to make a name for themselves in a city that seemed to offer little opportunity. But unlike other gangs, they understood the power of image. While others focused solely on brute force, the Knights combined style with street smarts. They wore designer labels like Gucci and Balenciaga, not just to look good, but to send a message. Their flashy appearance was a shield, a way to mask their intentions and gain respect in a world that often judged harshly. At first their crimes were small: shoplifting, selling counterfeit goods, and minor drug deals. But with every success, they grew bolder. Their fast cars and expensive jewelry attracted attention, turning heads in clubs and on the streets. They were no longer just criminals. They became trendsetters, symbols of a new era where fashion and crime collided. Night after night, the city's nightlife buzzed with their presence. Velvet ropes parted for them, and bartenders poured drinks as they walked in. Yet behind the glamorous facade was a darker truth. Their rise was built on fear and violence. Rumors began to spread about their ruthless methods. Rival gangs whispered of brutal beatings and silent hits carried out in the shadows. It wasn't long before the Knights' name was spoken with a mix of admiration and dread. They weren't just dressed for success, they were prepared to fight for it. As the city looked on, unaware of how quickly the gang's power would grow, a dangerous empire was quietly forming. The glitz and glamour were only the surface. Beneath it all lay a world where gunshots and Gucci went hand in hand, a world where loyalty was tested, and betrayal was just around the corner. The Knights were no longer small-time criminals. They were becoming legends in the dark streets, modern Britain. The Knights' rise from a small street gang to one of the most powerful criminal forces in London was both rapid and ruthless. Their control spread quickly, driven by a mix of ambition, violence, and strategic thinking. Unlike other gangs that relied on brute strength alone, the Knights understood how to build influence through both fear and respect. They expanded their reach by taking over drug routes that ran through the city's most dangerous neighborhoods. These routes became their lifeline, generating enormous profits and attracting attention from law enforcement and rival groups alike. At the same time, the Knights began to infiltrate the city's nightlife, transforming nightclubs from simple entertainment venues into battlegrounds for power and control. Owning or controlling a popular club meant more than just money. It was about status, influence, and access to wealthy clients. The Knights used their flashy image to gain entry into these exclusive circles, mixing with celebrities, socialites, and business figures. Their presence in these glamorous settings blurred the lines between high society and the criminal underworld, creating an illusion of untouchability. But behind the velvet ropes and champagne glasses lay a world fueled by violence and intimidation. The Knights were quick to remind anyone who challenged them that their power was real. Street battles erupted as rival gangs fought to protect their territory or take a piece of the Knights' growing empire. Gunshots became common sounds in neighborhoods that once only heard sirens. These clashes were not random acts of violence. They were carefully planned moves in a high-stakes game of survival and dominance. The gang also expanded their illegal operations beyond drugs and clubs. They became involved in arms trafficking, money laundering, protection rackets, turning their network into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Each new venture added to their wealth and influence, making them a force that seemed unstoppable. Their flashy lifestyle, fast cars, designer clothes, and expensive parties was both a symbol of their success and a tool to intimidate their enemies. However, Their rapid rise attracted growing attention from the police and rival gangs, setting the stage for conflict on multiple fronts. The Knights were no longer just a street gang. They were becoming a powerful criminal organization, with deep roots in both the underworld and the city's glamorous elite. This was a dangerous balancing act, where every move could lead to greater power or sudden downfall. The city watched in uneasy silence as the Knights' empire expanded, knowing that the next violent confrontation could erupt at any moment. For the Knights, fashion was more than just clothing. It was a language of power and identity. Among all the luxury brands they embraced, Gucci stood out as the ultimate symbol of their status. Wearing Gucci wasn't simply about style. It was a statement that said we belong to the top tier of this dangerous world. The gang's members wore the brand openly and proudly, from shoes and jackets to watches and sunglasses. This connection between designer labels and street crime created a new kind of image, one that was as much about appearance as it was about fear. Gucci became synonymous with the Knights' identity. Their reputation for violence was wrapped in the glitz of high fashion. This fusion confused many outsiders, who struggled to understand how men dressed like wealthy celebrities could be involved in brutal criminal activities. But for the gang it was a deliberate strategy. The luxury clothes and accessories created a barrier, a way to blend in with wealthy crowds while moving freely in dangerous neighborhoods. It was an armor that allowed them to command respect and intimidate rivals without always resorting to violence. The connection to Gucci also helped the Knights build alliances. Wealthy club owners, drug suppliers, and even corrupt officials were drawn in by the gang's glamorous image and seemingly unstoppable rise. The designer brand was a ticket to exclusive parties and high-profile connections, allowing the Knights to expand their influence beyond the streets. Their presence in luxury settings gave them access to information, opportunities and protection that many gangs could only dream of. But the love for Gucci also revealed the gang's vulnerabilities. The obsession with status symbols fueled jealousy and greed within their ranks. Members competed over who could wear the most expensive pieces, and disputes over stolen or lost items sometimes turned violent. The desire to maintain their luxurious image pushed the gang to take bigger risks, making dangerous deals and crossing lines that increased the chances of exposure and betrayal. Beneath the glossy surface, the Knights' world was unstable. The Gucci label was a mask that hid the growing tensions and cracks within the gang. While the brand symbolized power, it also represented the dangerous game they were playing, where style and violence were inseparable, and one wrong move could shatter the empire they had built. This chapter reveals how the Knights' obsession with Gucci was both their greatest strength and their deepest weakness. The night the nightclub brawl erupted would go down as one of the darkest moments in the Knights' history. What began as a routine evening at one of London's most exclusive clubs quickly spiraled into chaos, leaving a trail of blood and shattered glass. The club had become a regular gathering spot for the gang, a place where they flaunted their wealth and power. But that night, rival gangs showed up with a plan to challenge the Knights' dominance. The tension in the air was thick, and it wasn't long before words turned to violence. The fight was brutal and fast, erupting suddenly between rival groups who had been circling each other for weeks. Gunshots rang out inside the packed venue, causing panic as clubgoers scrambled for safety. The violence spilled outside, turning the once glamorous street into a scene of terror. Several members of the rival gang were killed, but the Knights also suffered losses. The incident shocked the city and marked a turning point in the gang's story. The Knights were no longer just stylish criminals. They had become ruthless warriors willing to kill to protect their empire. The nightclub massacre sent ripples through London's criminal underworld. Rival gangs realized the Knights were prepared to defend their turf at any cost, making future confrontations even more dangerous. The police, meanwhile, could no longer ignore the gang's growing threat. Public outcry over the violence pressured law enforcement to act, launching investigations and increasing surveillance on the Knights and their associates. But the violence inside the club revealed something more sinister. The Knights' grip on the city's nightlife was fragile. Their power depended on intimidation and alliances, but the nightclub brawl exposed cracks in their control. Rivals were emboldened, sensing that the gang's empire could be challenged. At the same time, the Knights faced scrutiny from within. Members questioned each other's loyalty as the pressure mounted, and paranoia began to creep into the ranks. This chapter exposes how a single violent night shifted the balance of power in London's gang landscape. The nightclub brawl wasn't just a fight, it was a declaration that the Knights' reign was both feared and fragile. The glamorous image they had worked so hard to build was under threat, and the next moves in this deadly game would determine whether the gang could survive or if their empire would crumble under the weight of violence and betrayal. At the center of the Knights' empire was a man known only as Silk. His nickname reflected his smooth way of moving through both the streets and the high society scenes. Silk was not just a gang leader, he was a mastermind who combined intelligence, charm, and ruthless ambition to control the organization. While others relied on brute force, Silk ruled with a calculated approach, knowing when to use violence and when to negotiate. His vision transformed the Knights from a small group of street criminals into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Silk's leadership style was unique. He was rarely seen in public without his signature tailored suits and expensive accessories, reinforcing the gang's image of wealth and power. But beneath the polished exterior was a sharp mind that controlled every aspect of the gang's operations. From drug trafficking and arms deals to money laundering and club ownership, he maintained strict discipline within the ranks, rewarding loyalty and swiftly punishing betrayal. This tight control helped keep the gang united even as outside pressures grew. One of Silk's greatest strengths was his ability to build alliances. He understood that surviving in London's criminal underworld required more than muscle. Through connections with corrupt officials, businessmen, and other gangs, he expanded the Knights' influence beyond the city streets. These relationships gave the gang protection and access to new opportunities, making them nearly untouchable. Silk's network extended into the highest levels of society, blurring the lines between the legal and illegal worlds. Despite his outward confidence, Silk faced constant threats. Rival gangs wanted his territory, and law enforcement was closing in. The pressure forced him to become increasingly secretive, moving key operations underground and trusting fewer people. This paranoia, while keeping him cautious, also planted seeds of distrust within the gang. Members wondered who Silk truly trusted and who might be working against him. Silk's control seemed absolute, but hidden cracks were beginning to form. His empire, built on both fear and respect, was vulnerable to internal conflict. As the gang's enemies grew bolder, and with whispers of betrayal spreading, Silk's leadership would soon be tested in ways no one expected. This chapter reveals how the Kingpin's rise set the stage for a battle not just against outside forces, but against enemies lurking within his own ranks. Tensions within the Knights began to rise as whispers of betrayal spread through the gang's ranks. What once had been a tight-knit group bound by loyalty and shared ambition, now found itself fractured by suspicion and fear. The disappearance of one of Silk's most trusted lieutenants sent shockwaves through the organization. No one knew where he had gone, and rumors quickly spread that he might have turned against the gang, working with the police or rival factions. This uncertainty shattered the sense of unity that had held the Knights together. Paranoia took root. Every conversation, every meeting became a test of loyalty. Members watched each other closely, searching for signs of betrayal. Trust was no longer given freely, it had to be earned, and constantly proven. This atmosphere of distrust weakened the gang's once solid foundation. Deals became harder to negotiate, and operations slowed as Silk and his inner circle tried to identify the mole within their ranks. The pressure from the outside only made things worse. Law enforcement agencies had stepped up their efforts to dismantle the Knights, using information leaked from inside the gang to plan raids and arrests. Rival gangs sensed the opportunity and moved to exploit the growing chaos. What had once been clear territory became a battleground where enemies lurked in every shadow. Internal conflicts turned violent. Disputes that might have been settled quietly, before now exploded into brutal confrontations. Members who were once close allies found themselves on opposite sides of growing divisions. Some chose to leave, fearing for their safety, or hoping to escape the increasing violence. Others were accused of betrayal and dealt with harshly. The gang's code of silence was breaking down, and with it the power that Silk had carefully built. This chapter exposes the dangerous cracks appearing inside the Knights. It shows how betrayal isn't always the work of outsiders, but often comes from within. The gang's greatest threat was no longer rival groups or the police. It was the fear and mistrust tearing it apart from the inside. As the Knights struggled to hold together, the hidden enemy grew stronger. Read the discovery of a hidden enemy, someone from within their own ranks secretly working against them. For years, the gang had operated under the belief that their biggest threats were rival gangs and relentless police investigations, but the real danger was much closer. The Mole was a trusted member who had carefully gained the gang's confidence, learning every detail of their operations, their weaknesses, and their secrets. This betrayal was a devastating blow that no one saw coming. The Mole's work was precise and calculated. They passed sensitive information to law enforcement, tipping them off about drug shipments, arms deals, and meeting locations. With this insider knowledge, police raids became more frequent and effective, catching the Knights off guard time and again. Arrests followed, and key members were taken off the streets, severely weakening the gang structure. What made this betrayal even more damaging was how it fueled distrust within the gang itself. No one knew who could be trusted anymore. The Mole's identity remained a mystery for months, causing chaos and suspicion to spread like wildfire. Every member was under scrutiny, and accusations flew without proof. This internal suspicion made it nearly impossible for the gang to operate smoothly. Plans were delayed or cancelled, and opportunities slipped away. Rival gangs seized the moment to challenge the Knights' dominance, knowing their enemy was distracted and divided. As police pressure increased and arrests piled up, Silk's control began to slip. His once unshakable empire showed signs of crumbling under the weight of betrayal and outside attacks. The hidden enemy had not only provided law enforcement with critical intelligence, but had also fractured the gang's unity beyond repair. Members who had been loyal started to question their allegiance, and some even considered turning informant themselves to protect their own futures. The revelation of the Mole marked a turning point in the Knights' story. The gang's empire, built on guile, power, and fear, was no longer invincible. This chapter uncovers how a single traitor inside the gang unleashed a chain reaction of arrests, mistrust, and violence that shook the Knights' empire to its core. It was a betrayal that changed everything, leaving the gang vulnerable and setting the stage for their eventual downfall. With the Mole's information in hand, law enforcement launched a large-scale operation aimed at dismantling the Knights once and for all. Known as Operation Nightfall, this crackdown was the most intense and coordinated effort the police had ever made against the gang. Months of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover work had built a strong case, and the authorities were ready to act decisively. The operation targeted the gang's entire network, from street-level dealers to high-ranking members, striking at the heart of their empire. In the early hours of a cold morning, police units raided dozens of locations across London. Luxury apartments, nightclubs, warehouses, and hidden stash houses were stormed with overwhelming force. The arrests were swift and widespread, catching many members by surprise. Among those taken into custody were key figures responsible for drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and money laundering. These raids sent a clear message. The Knights' reign of terror was being challenged like never before. Operation Nightfall exposed the full scale of the gang's criminal activities. Authorities uncovered secret weapon caches, large quantities of illegal drugs, and documents revealing complex money laundering schemes. The evidence revealed a network far more sophisticated than previously thought, with connections reaching into legitimate businesses and even corrupt officials. This chapter reveals how the police pieced together the puzzle that had long eluded them, using the Mole's insider knowledge to break through the gang's carefully built defenses. The crackdown also created chaos within the Knights. With so many leaders arrested or in hiding, the gang struggled to maintain order. Rival groups took advantage of the weakened state, pushing to claim territory and settle old scores. Meanwhile, the Knight's remaining members faced increasing pressure to cooperate with the police, or risk being left behind. This chapter details the rising desperation as the gang's empire began to crumble. Operation Nightfall marked a turning point in the fight against organized crime in London. It showed that even the most powerful gangs could be brought down with careful planning and insider intelligence. But while the police scored a major victory, the shadow of the Knights still loomed large. The operation dealt a heavy blow, but the gang's legacy of violence and glamour continued to influence the city's criminal underworld. Silk's downfall was as dramatic as his rise had been. Once the untouchable kingpin of the Knights, he found himself cornered, betrayed by those he once trusted most. As Operation Nightfall dismantled the gang's infrastructure, Silk struggled to hold on to control, but the pressure from law enforcement, rival gangs, and the growing mistrust within his own ranks became impossible to withstand. His carefully constructed empire began to crumble from all sides. The final blow came when some of Silk's closest allies turned against him to save themselves. Faced with long prison sentences and dangerous enemies, these former loyalists chose survival over loyalty. They provided the police with critical information about Silk's whereabouts and operations. The betrayal was a bitter pill for Silk, exposing how fragile power can be when built on fear and deception. Once surrounded by friends and followers, he now found himself isolated and hunted. The arrest was swift and heavily publicized. Silk was caught during a covert raid in a luxury flat, surrounded evidence linking him to multiple crimes. The media painted him as the glamorous criminal mastermind brought down by his own ambition and mistakes. For many, his capture symbolized justice finally catching up to one of Britain's most feared gang leaders. But behind the headlines was a man stripped of power, facing the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. Silk's fall sparked shockwaves throughout the criminal underworld. With their leader behind bars, the Knight's remaining members scrambled to fill the power vacuum. Some sought to regroup and fight back, while others fled or turned informant. The gang that had once ruled with an iron fist now struggled to survive. Rival groups moved in quickly to claim territory, and the violence that followed threatened to plunge the city into chaos. This chapter follows Silk's dramatic downfall from kingpin to prisoner, revealing how quickly fortunes can change in the dangerous world of organized crime. It shows the human cost of a life built on violence and betrayal, and asks whether power gained through fear can ever truly last. Silk's story is a cautionary tale about ambition, loyalty, and the inevitable consequences of a criminal empire built on shaky foundations. With Silk behind bars and the Knights dismantled, London streets seemed to breathe a cautious sigh of relief. The gang that had once dominated the city's criminal underworld was no more, or so it appeared. In the aftermath, the city faced a complex and uncertain reality. The fall of the Knights left a power vacuum that others rushed to fill. Smaller gangs and new players emerged, eager to claim a piece of the lucrative drug trade and nightlife control. Violence flared as these groups fought for dominance, proving that the end of one empire did not mean the end of the crime. Many former Knights disappeared without a trace, going underground to avoid arrest or revenge attacks. Some tried to leave the criminal life behind, but the shadows of their past made it difficult to escape. Others chose to cooperate with the police, becoming informants in hopes of reducing their sentences. The streets became a place of shifting alliances, with former enemies sometimes joining forces and old friends turning into foes. The glamour and danger that had defined the Knights continued to influence the city's underworld in new and unpredictable ways. The law enforcement victory was significant but incomplete. Operation Nightfall and Silk's arrest demonstrated that even the most powerful gangs could be challenged and broken apart. However, the roots of gang culture, poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity remained deeply embedded in many neighborhoods. The cycle of crime and violence continued, with new gangs adapting to survive in a changing world. The flashy clothes and designer labels might change, but the hunger for power and control stayed the same. This chapter reflects on the lasting impact of the Knights and what their story reveals about modern Britain's criminal landscape. It asks whether true change is possible, or if the cycle of glamour and violence is destined to repeat itself. The rise and fall of the knights serve as a stark reminder of how easily power can corrupt and how fragile even the strongest empires really are. Their legacy is a complex mix of fear, fascination, and unanswered questions about the future of crime in Britain's cities. Gunshots and Gucci closes with a sobering thought. The glamorous facade may fade, but beneath the surface, the dangerous game of power, loyalty, and betrayal continues to play out in the shadows.